Defense Special Weapons Agency, or DSWA, traces its origins to the dawn of the atomic era. It was the first joint service organization and the first defense agency. The agency's predecessor organizations were different from the traditional rank-and-file military organization. Agency history begins in World War II with the formation of the Manhattan Engineer District to oversee the secret development of the world's first atomic bomb. Manhattan Project scientists and engineers built the first 3 atomic bombs. They successfully detonated the first bomb, an event called Trinity, on July 16, 1945, near the remote town of Alamogordo, New Mexico. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the second nuclear bomb over Hiroshima, Japan. 3 days later, the United States dropped the third atomic bomb over Nagasaki, Japan. Within a few weeks, the Japanese government surrendered, ending World War II on September 2, 1945. After the war, the Manhattan Project was dissolved, and 2 organizations, one civilian, the other military, were established in its place. The civilian organization, the Atomic Energy Commission, was formed December 31, 1946. It was the forerunner of the Department of Energy. The military organization was called the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project, or AFSWP. It was formed January 29, 1947, and located at Sandia Base in Albuquerque, New Mexico. AFSWP's missions were important for the nation's defense. The Cold War was just beginning. The United States and its allies were determined to halt aggression by the Soviet Union, which was racing to build and test a nuclear weapon. The agency's missions included understanding nuclear weapons effects and helping ensure the reliability and effectiveness of U.S. strategic forces. AFSWP assured readiness by training the military for atomic warfare. Agency personnel taught units how to assemble and use atomic weapons. In April 1948, the Soviets blocked road and rail access to Berlin. The U.S. and Great Britain airlifted food and supplies to Berlin. President Truman later approved deploying B-29 bombers to British bases. Deploying the bombers, which could carry nuclear weapons, showed a U.S. commitment to deter Soviet military aggression in Western Europe. Since there were only about 50 U.S. nuclear weapons, the Air Force planned an elaborate deception to signal nuclear weapons deployment to Britain 2 years before they were actually sent. AFSWP personnel supported this plan. Debris from the first Soviet atomic test was detected in September 1949. The United States was determined to maintain its technological lead in nuclear weapons. The Atomic Energy Commission and AFSWP jointly researched weapons vulnerabilities and nuclear weapons effects. Personnel planned and coordinated military service needs for nuclear test data. AFSWP and the Atomic Energy Commission chose the Nevada test site as a continental test area. AFSWP sponsored many nuclear weapons effects experiments at this site. In the 1950s, the Cold War drew closer to home as the U.S. population built nuclear bomb fallout shelters and practiced emergency procedures to use in the event of a nuclear attack by the Soviet Union. During the Korean War, President Truman was concerned that war would spread to Europe. So he approved AFSWP support to Strategic Air Command nuclear-capable units overseas. AFSWP personnel at Sandia Base were on alert to deliver insertable nuclear components to arm weapons. The assembly teams could deploy within 12 hours of notification. In 1951, about 5,000 troops trained to operate in nuclear environments during atmospheric and cratering tests at the Nevada test site. The United States detonated the world's first thermonuclear bomb in the South Pacific in November 1952. The Soviets conducted a thermonuclear test in August 1953. After the armistice in Korea, the United States expanded deployments of nuclear weapons in Europe and declared a readiness to use nuclear weapons for tactical defense and strategic bombardment. AFSWP coordinated nuclear tests and troop training before tactical nuclear forces were deployed to Europe in 1954. Military personnel were trained to fire tactical nuclear weapons and to take precautions to cope with ionizing radiation. At that time, AFSWP began maintaining a centralized reporting and accounting system to account for the status and location of all nuclear weapons at all times. This key function continues today. In 1954, President Eisenhower approved plans to disperse nuclear weapons storage sites managed by service personnel in the continental United States. AFSWP trained military storage and maintenance staffs, inspected service sites, and managed national stockpile sites in coordination with the Atomic Energy Commission. As technology advanced, U.S. research and testing took advantage of and spurred new developments. These developments enabled strategic missiles to carry thermonuclear warheads. Later, strategic missiles could carry several independently targeted weapons. Atmospheric tests for nuclear weapon effects helped the military services design survivable U.S. weapon systems and basing modes. AFSWP conducted tests to assess blast and thermal effects on aircraft, missiles, and air crews. Following several Air Force bomber-related accidents, the services, AFSWP, and the Atomic Energy Commission established a joint nuclear accident coordinating center in 1958, which continues to operate today. In addition to new accident responsibilities, DoD began allocating the majority of nuclear effects research and test funds through AFSWP in 1958. To reflect these increases in roles and missions, AFSWP was redesignated as the Defense Atomic Support Agency, or DESA, in 1959. DESA retained its field operations in Albuquerque and moved its headquarters to the Washington metropolitan area, where it has remained with mission, organizational, and name changes during the ensuing years. In 1958, AFSWP and the Atomic Energy Commission conducted the first U.S. high-altitude nuclear effects tests. The U.S. shot Teak over Johnston Atoll in the Pacific Ocean disturbed long-haul high-frequency communications over much of the Pacific. Operation Argus in the Atlantic Ocean showed that radiation in space could cause satellite semiconductor circuits to degrade and fail. To ensure weapon systems could survive nuclear attacks, DESA conducted experiments on cratering, air blast, and ground shock at the Nevada test site and elsewhere. Later in the 1960s, DESA supported the Air Force in designing hardened silos. The United States and the Soviets established a nuclear test moratorium in 1958. However, the Soviets unexpectedly resumed atmospheric testing in 1961. Agency scientists first analyzed the effects of nuclear weapons on underground facilities in 1961, when the White House requested an assessment of the alternate National Military Command Center at Fort Ritchie, Maryland. Concern about the vulnerability of missile guidance systems, reentry vehicles, and nuclear warheads grew as more was learned about the effects of X-rays on materials and electronics. The 1962 underground test Marshmallow confirmed radiation could damage space and missile system components. Subsequent tests resulted in retrofits for some existing strategic missile systems and designed-in hardening for later systems. As multiple independently targeted strategic missiles began development, underground tests and above-ground simulators were planned to investigate their vulnerability to X-ray effects. Atmospheric nuclear weapons tests in 1962 caused upper atmosphere disturbances, reconfirming that radiation could interfere with radio and radar communications. The military became concerned about its communication satellites, its early warning, and anti-ballistic missile radars. A 1962 high-altitude atmospheric nuclear test series confirmed electromagnetic pulse effects predicted by earlier DESA research. The Starfish Prime nuclear test generated a surge of electromagnetic energy that shorted out street lamps on Hawaii about 800 miles away. DESA was the center of expertise in the design of communications and command systems that could withstand electromagnetic pulse effects. President Kennedy and Russia's Premier Khrushchev signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963, banning nuclear testing in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. DESA had already conducted tests underground. The last U.S. atmospheric test occurred at Johnston Atoll in the Pacific on November 4, 1962. DESA designed and funded many weapon system survivability tests. While DESA conducted some underground nuclear tests to investigate air blast and ground shock effects, the bulk of the underground tests were dedicated to investigate radiation effects on electronics, materials, and systems. Underground tests assured missiles under development were hardened against nuclear effects. Tests often showed the systems needed to be redesigned to survive a nuclear environment. DESA scientists also developed radiation simulators to assess electromagnetic pulse, gamma ray, and X-ray effects. The agency conducted less costly, large-scale or kiloton-size conventional high-explosive test beds to simulate nuclear air blast and ground shock effects. In 1966, an Air Force plane carrying nuclear weapons crashed near Palomares, Spain. DESA coordinated emergency response to remove radioactive debris and recover the weapons. In 1968, an Air Force nuclear weapons accident occurred near Thule, Greenland. DESA oversaw Air Force decontamination efforts that removed 237 tons of radioactive ice and debris from the B-52 crash site. In 1971, the agency was renamed the Defense Nuclear Agency, or DNA. Since then, DNA sponsored all U.S. nuclear weapon effects tests. One test exposed a defense satellite communication system mock-up to nuclear effects. The unique vertical line-of-sight test configuration exposed the satellite in its vacuum chamber, which was then rapidly pulled away prior to the collapse of the underground cavity and the formation of the subsidence crater at the surface. As ballistic missile accuracy improved, DNA assessed new protective structures for the United States and studied potential vulnerabilities of Soviet-hardened targets. The silo test program